it's just very special, and having her here for this book about Sanora Babb is even more special. And thirdly, I've forgotten to tell you some important things, which is, if you have anything that makes noise, cell phone or watch, whichever, if you can make sure it's not going to make noise during the talk, that would be greatly appreciated. Her books are available at the counter, and she'll be signing at the table where we had all of those really cool Forgotten Women books, which is right next to the wine table. So the cool thing is, if you do a straight shot, you can buy the book and then wait in line. The hard part is that Iris has to get to where she's signing. So we're going to try and move her along in the background, and then we can make everything work. And now I can go back to telling you how awesome Iris is. So it's a funny thing to say, because I think I see her 4 times a year. But when this book came out, when she got her Ken Burns blurb, when she got her New York Times interview, which came out, yesterday, it was all just so exciting, and I felt so proud. You know, I was like, I barely see Iris. It's a little weird to be in front of her, but I'm so proud. From 2017 to 2018, she was the Poet Laureate of Sonoma County, which Sonoma County is filled with poets. I think that's one of the best things about Sonoma County. So being the Poet Laureate of Sonoma County really matters. She currently runs the Finding Lost Voices project, which is a Substack that you guys can subscribe to, and I highly recommend it. I get it. You end up learning about all of these people who, along with Sanora Babb, people have forgotten. You know, there's a lot of, especially women throughout time, that did a lot of work that got a little covered over. We don't talk about them anymore. We don't know their work anymore. And it's time to dig them out. It's time to talk about them. So I don't know too much about Sanora Babb, but Iris knows an awful lot about Sanora Babb. So if you could give her a round of applause.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. It's such a pleasure to be at Readers Books. It feels like, it's like a home store to me. They've been supporting my work since my first poetry collection came out. So thank you, Andy. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, if Jude's still here, and Puddle. Thank you. And also thank you to my friends who are here, who have supported me through the 5 years that it's taken to research and write this book. I really couldn't have gotten here without you guys, and I really appreciate you listening to stories of Sanora Babb endlessly for 5 years. So this book is dedicated to both my grandmother, who came over in the Dust Bowl, Mary Louise Kirby, and to Joanne Bierkop, who was Sanora Babb's editor, turned really good friend, turned literary executor, who, over glasses of wine in the 1970s and 80s, made a promise to her friend that she would keep her books in print even after she died. And the reason why I'm here telling Sanora's story today is because of her friendship with Joanne. And it tells you a lot about the kind of person that Sanora Babb was, that somebody would make a promise like that to keep her books in print. I first met Sanora Babb when I saw the Ken Burns documentary called The Dust Bowl, where he features Sanora, and I immediately fell in love with her story, because she comes from the Panhandle. And when I Googled her, that's when I discovered Joanne. She was on the other side of Sanora's website, and I put the contact form in, and I was like, oh, could I get some books about Sanora Babb? And she's like, yes! And she immediately pulled me into all these projects, because that's the kind of person that Joanne was. When I finished the book, she gave me this coat, and this was Sanora Babb's coat. And it was, we lost Joanne in April of this year, and she did get to see the book, but trying not to cry every time I say this, but this book wouldn't have happened without her. And so I think it's really important to recognize that as writers, it's an unknown world out there, and we have to support each other, and those support systems happen even beyond our lifetimes, which I'm so grateful for. So I'm going to start by reading the introduction, which begins with a quotation from Patti Smith. Do you know her music? I was at a concert this summer when I was doing edits, and Patti Smith got up on the stage and she's like, "You gotta use your voice," and I was like, "I'm gonna use your voice." Thank you very much. So, use your voice, Patti Smith. I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a writer. But when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s in rural Northern California, I was rarely assigned women writers to read in class. Having grown up in the West, I've always been drawn to writers who wrote about the West. When I was assigned books by Jack London, John Steinbeck, and Wallace Stegner, I was mesmerized by how they wrote about the land on which I lived. Judging by their depictions of the West, as well as those presented in film and on television, however, someone like me, a woman, had little to do with the West, and we certainly never received much acclaim for writing about it. My grandmother grew up in the panhandle of Oklahoma, and she and her family were forced to leave their farm when dust storms destroyed their crops. It was a tough journey, one that would scar my grandmother with its trauma for the rest of her life. My grandmother was proud of her survival, but she didn't want to talk about it, and she most certainly didn't want others to tell her story for her. When I was in high school, we were assigned John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. After I read it, I rushed home to call my grandmother to tell her, "Grandma, did you know they wrote a book about us?" She told me Steinbeck got it all wrong. She said he made her and her family look like helpless victims. She said not to mention the book ever again. Mm-hmm. For a long time, I was confused by my grandmother's reaction. Why was she so upset about this great author's work? How had Steinbeck gotten it wrong? In my schooling up to that point, I had been trained to prioritize the published fictional account written by Steinbeck, a man, over my grandmother's firsthand and of course more accurate real-life experience. I had no idea how right my grandmother's reaction was. When I first stumbled upon and read Sanora Babb's novel, Whose Names Are Unknown, written in the late 1930s while she was volunteering with the Farm Security Administration, which built resettlement camps for Dust Bowl refugees, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I found mention of her book while I was watching Ken Burns' award-winning documentary, The Dust Bowl, which features extensive excerpts from Babb's notes and reports and showcases Babb's unique knowledge of the Dust Bowl and its victims. Burns introduces Babb as someone who, like the refugees, had grown up in the affected area around the Oklahoma Panhandle and was deeply committed to, quote, establishing a trust and respect with the refugees that extended both ways. Babb's was a story that humanized the experiences of those who had suffered through the worst natural disaster the United States had ever faced thus far. A version where we got to know the characters before the worst days of their lives, when they had to flee to California to find work, where we saw the lives of women and children through their own eyes, and where we saw Black, Mexican, and Filipino workers in the fields and organizing strikes side by side with the whites. Here was a book that told a version of the Dust Bowl that aligned with the one my grandmother had told me. Babb was a writer who reported the human truth. As her friend, the poet Anne Stanford, wrote about her work, she represents the truth about life, even in its rough beauty. By the time I finished reading Whose Names Are Unknown, I had become fascinated with Babb and knew that she had to be my next biographical subject. I decided to write my first biography, Charmian Kittredge London, trailblazer, author, adventurer, about Jack London's wife, an amazing woman who disregarded gender norms when I found out that she had helped write many of her husband's novels and had never been given credit for that work. That biography was used as a source for a remodel of the museum at Jack London State Historic Park, housed in Charmian's previous home, the House of Happy Walls. Now, when young girls visit the park, they will be introduced to two writers, Jack London and Charmian Kittredge London. This physical representation of my work has motivated me to commit my career to unearthing the stories of women who have been forgotten or misremembered. The more I learn, the more I research, the more I realize how many women have been erased, not only from the history of the West, but from human history. It is an arduous task to tell the story of a life. Babb hated writing biographical statements and was cautious of any biographer who wanted to take on the task of writing a biography about her husband, the Academy Award-winning cinematographer James Wong Howe. Thankfully, Babb left a wide trail of materials, mainly at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin, everything from the pair of beaded moccasins Chief Black Hawk gave her when she was just 5 years old and living in Red Rock, Oklahoma, to drafts of her novels, memoirs, poems, and short stories, to long letters to and from friends, to boxes and boxes of photographs. But while Babb could control what she left as her personal archive, she could not control how others would remember her. The word archive comes from the ancient Greek archeion, the house of the ruler. That means that what is placed in or what is left out of the archive is a political act. When you read the biographies of Babb's contemporaries, the novelists Ralph Ellison, William Saroyan, John Fante, and Carlos Bulassan, whom she supported and who were her literary equals, you rarely see Babb's name mentioned. The omission of her name and many of her contemporaries' names has had a lasting effect. Women's stories, especially those of women who were inspired by the likes of proto-feminists like Edna St. Vincent Millay to cast off the monogamous, heterosexual gender norms that have been placed on them, were written out of the record after World War II during the, quote, silent decade, when women's lives were subjected to, quote, the isolation of suburban domesticity beneath the decorative facade of respectability and resentment. This, combined with the blacklisting that occurred during the Red Scare, left many once popular female leftist writers of the 1930s and 40s unpopular and at odds with gender norms. My research made me wonder, what would have happened if I had been assigned Babbs whose names are unknown in school, in addition, or even instead of the Grapes of Wrath? Not only would I have seen my own family's experience within the history I was being taught, but I also would have been given an example of a foremother, a woman writer who was writing about the West. This biography aims to correct the record by returning to the archives with the intent of writing Sanora Babb's name back into the canon that has forgotten her. The life of Sanora Babb teaches us something about how to better understand the story of the American West. Hers is a story of a strong woman who was not deterred by those who wished to tell her story for her, or by those who would not let her tell her own story. This biography challenges the set canon of the American West by adding Babb's name to that elite and ever-growing list. So in this book, at the heart of it, after telling you amazing stories about Sanora Babb's life, is the story of John Steinbeck, appropriating notes from Sanora Babb and making this book, which was written in 1938 to 39 and was under contract with Random House, not publishable until 2004. And so I'm going to read you part of that in just a second, but I want to share a writing process thing with you since many of you are friends. Also, notice the logo, Napa Valley Writers Conference. Like I said, Steinbeck was one of my favorite writers growing up, and so I was feeling a little trepidation about the idea of taking on writing about this thing that happened with Steinbeck. And then I was getting on a plane to go to Oklahoma to give a reading at the University of Oklahoma, and I was like, well, I'm going to read The Grapes of Wrath again. And so I grabbed it off the shelf at the San Francisco airport. I was on the plane and I started reading it, and I was like, oh my God, my grandmother's voice started speaking to me. If you're a poet, you understand. I was like, I can't write a biography and have my grandmother's voice in it. So I started erasing The Grapes of Wrath. So I started writing a book of poems about Sanora Babb and about my grandmother's experience by circling letters and words from this book, which became another collection called Endnotes on the West. But I was just doing this as an exercise, like a workbook to get to my chapters. And I was at Vermont Studio Center, and I was sitting, at the kitchen table eating and working on my erasure. And these artists came over. They're like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm just doing my pre-work before I start writing my chapters." And they were like, "You're making art." And I was like, no, this is just my warm up, and they were like, "Just come to my studio with a bottle of wine and I'll teach you photo transfer, or I'll teach you how to, do these stitches, or I'll teach you how to." So they slowly, like, one of them gave me this mesh to put Steinbeck in a cage and bedazzle Sanora Babb. So it was really a collective experience. And it's been a really empowering process to learn about this technique for a lot of people who are trying to embody their voices in a place where their voices are often silenced. And so I often teach workshops now on erasure because it really helped me with my artistic process. That's the end of the erasure commercial. Okay, this is chapter 11, Whose Names Are Unknown. A few months into her job volunteering for the FSA, and this is 1938, Tom Collins invited Babb to a nearby cafe to have lunch with a writer he was collaborating with, named John Steinbeck. Steinbeck, who had just published a best-selling novel of Mice and Men in February 1937, had found Collins while he was writing a series of articles on the plight of the Dust Bowl refugees for the San Francisco News, which were published from October 5th to 12th, 1936. Steinbeck had again visited, thinking that having a best-selling writer bring attention to the struggling camps would be beneficial, Collins agreed to accompany Steinbeck as he visited the camps. Steinbeck had been so overwhelmed the first time he accompanied Collins and saw the absolute poverty that the migrants had to suffer. He told Collins, quote, "By God, I can't stand anymore. I'm going away and blow the lid off this place." Steinbeck had again visited Collins for a few days in mid-October 1937. When the writer returned home, he began working on his first attempt at writing his Dust Bowl novel, a manuscript he called The Oklahomans. By January 1938, he'd abandoned this manuscript altogether and started his second attempt, L'Affaire Lettisburg. In this second version, begun in February and finished in May 1938, Steinbeck's focus shifted from writing about the refugees to mocking the growers. But by the time he finished, he was so disheartened by it that he destroyed the manuscript before his agent, who was already marketing the book, had seen it. Collins was thrilled that Steinbeck was writing a novel and hoped he might bring attention to the desperate issues faced by the refugees. As Collins wrote in his own unpublished memoir, Bringing in the Sheaves, he pleaded with Steinbeck to write about what he had witnessed. "What you want to do, John, is to keep your impressions in your mind, and when the time is right, do something about those conditions. If you fail to do that, then you are letting those thousands of people down." During Steinbeck's visits, none of the migrants knew that they were being observed by a famous writer who intended to document their experiences, as Steinbeck used a fictitious name while he was in the camps. According to Jackson Benson's biography of Steinbeck, the writer hid his identity while he was with Collins because he was afraid of retaliation by the Associated Farmers and other growers' associations. However, Steinbeck did not hide his identity from Babb. It was during Steinbeck's May 1938 visit with Collins, after he'd abandoned two versions of the book he wanted to write, that he met Babb. That sunny day, as Babb walked into the cafe, the rainy season had subsided, and the earth was throbbing with the possibility of new crops and jobs for the workers. Over cups of coffee, they talked about the camps, the refugees' plight, the terrible control the Associated Farmers held over the communities where they lived, and the powerful political lobby of farm owners. Little did Babb know that the copy of her field notes that she would willingly give Steinbeck would not only inspire him as he began his third and final attempt at writing his Dust Bowl novel, but would also make the publishing of her own novel impossible. As she later reflected, quote, "Tom Collins had asked me to keep detailed notes of our work every day, of the people, things they said, did, suffered, worked. I thought it was for our work, or for him, but it was for Steinbeck. And Tom asked me to give him my notes. I did. Naive me. Meanwhile, Bennett Cerf at Random House was impressed with the 4 chapters that Babb had sent him, so much so that he invited her to New York to finish writing her novel and offered her a book contract to go with it. In Whose Names Are Unknown, when we meet Babb's protagonist, Milt Dunn, on the Oklahoma Panhandle, he's living with his father, Conkey, who has decided to switch from growing broom corn to the potentially more lucrative winter wheat, a crop that needs more water than the dry farm broom corn. Babb obtained the background information on farming winter wheat from her father, Walt. Winter wheat in general started sowing it about September 15th, grows under snow, harvest starts 1st of July. The switch would prove to be futile as dust storms began to plague the land where the family was living. In her novel, Babb initiates us into the routine of her characters' daily lives and shows us how intimate they are with the land on which they live. Quote, Milt and the old man rose every morning at daybreak. When they came up into the yard, the sharp, high air of western autumn came into their noses, penetrated their clothes, made them go about their chores briskly. Each morning they felt renewed in themselves, and a clear, unknown excitement sprang up in them with the sense of a new season. They looked at the land they had planted the day before, and the land they would plant this day, and they felt a sense of possession growing in them for the piece of earth that was theirs. As readers, we watch the catastrophe of the Dust Bowl unfold slowly. Babb's characters helpless against what has struck them. She describes what the same land looks like after a horrific night of dust storms. Quote, all night the dust blew, and by morning the yard wore the melancholy look of a place revisited after years of desertion and ruin. The deeply personal effect of the storms on the Dunn family is depicted towards the end of the first half of the novel through a series of heart-wrenching diary entries from the month of April. Quote, noon, ate on a dirty, dusty plate, took up 15 to 20 pounds of dust to make room for more. The dirt is in waves. Think someone's farm is in our house, maybe our own. Babb based these intimate descriptions on ones written to her by her mother in a letter she had sent about the black blizzard dust storm that hit Garden City, Kansas in 1935. As the dust storms increase, the reader witnesses the devastation that slowly creeps over the town and its surrounding farms like a deadly tide. Farms are lost to the banks. Doctors watch helplessly as patients waste away from starvation. The owner of the general store commits suicide because he's extended too much credit to patrons who cannot pay. Because we have witnessed, quote, the human dimensions of this ecological disaster and the daily struggles of the people in this small community, by the time Milt and Julia Dunn leave for California with their children, we know they have no other choice. It is this tragedy that fuels our compassion for them as they are treated as outcasts by both the corporate growers and the regular citizens in California. By emphasizing her characters' lives before they were forced to migrate, Babb humanizes them. Babb continued to work at the camps until late October or November, when she returned home to work on her book and reunite with her sister and Hal. But she soon realized that to finish her book, she needed the time and space to write. So the following spring, she took the train to New York City to finish her manuscript while living on the Upper West Side with her friend, the dancer, Lotta Goslar. She loved living in New York City and knowing her first book was nearing completion. The early summer was boiling hot, but she sat at her desk and diligently completed editing her book and turned it in to Bennett Cerf, her editor at Random House. Cerf wrote to Babb on July 27, 1939, to say that the readers' reports on Whose Names Are Unknown had come back exceptionally fine, and told her that he wanted to, quote, read it myself. He promised to get back to Babb within a week. However, a week later, when Cerf invited her to the Random House offices to meet with him, she faced a situation she never could have expected. When she entered his office, he was seated formally at his desk, which was cleared of everything except, quote, a check under his hands. She knew right away that something had gone wrong. Though the reading reports about her book had been extremely positive, Cerf explained to Babb that her publishing contract for whose names are unknown had been canceled due to the wide success of Steinbeck's new book, The Grapes of Wrath. By June 1939, The Grapes of Wrath had sold over 200,000 copies, and film rights to the book had been sold for $75,000. Steinbeck's fame, which had already been solidified by his best-selling 1937 novel of Mice and Men, was skyrocketing. Babb was speechless and left Cerf's office in utter and complete shock. The two readers' reports about Babb's book had the same complaints, that it would, quote, almost seem as if Sanora Babb and John Steinbeck had thoroughly discussed an identical theme and set out to write their separate books. So similar are The Grapes of Wrath and Whose Names Are Unknown. They go on to explain Babb's approach. Quote, the plight of these people is described with great understanding that indicates personal experience. Whereas Grapes had color, excitement, and humor, Babb's book is more uniformly intense, more a piece of the drabness of her people. What's heartbreaking is how the reviewer closes the report. Quote, if there hadn't been a Grapes, I would say unreservedly, here is something new, something fine, we must publish. Moreover, an unusual talent is displayed in this first novel. In subsequent letters, Cerf, who acknowledged the craft of Babb's novel, but couldn't see his way to publishing two books about the same event, advised Babb to put her manuscript away for a few years until the market might be more receptive to another novel about the Dust Bowl, as he wrote to her in a letter on August 16, 1939. After viewing the matter from every angle and discussing it in a full editorial conference for an hour, I don't see how in God's green earth we can publish Whose Names Are Unknown. What rotten luck for you that The Grapes of Wrath should not only have come out before your book was submitted, but should have so swept the country. Obviously, another book at this time about exactly the same subject would be a sad anticlimax. And I think that you must face the fact that, as we did here, the last third of your book is so completely like The Grapes of Wrath that the families and characters might basically be interchanged in the two. Before she left New York to return to Los Angeles, Babb pleaded with Cerf, but nothing she said changed his mind. When she said she'd have her agent shop her manuscript around to other publishers, he explained that she was welcome to do so, but he knew their answer would be the same as his. Sadly, Cerf was right. Babb sent her manuscript to all the main publishing houses that fall and winter, and each rejection letter echoed sentiments similar to Cerf's. Her writing was good, but because of the success of The Grapes of Wrath and the uncertain times of a possible war, the publishers couldn't take a risk on Babb's first novel. Babb didn't give up on her novel without a fight. Even after Bennett Cerf and so many other New York publishers had rejected her work, Babb continued to seek support. When Babb wrote her Guggenheim application in late 1939, she asserted the difference between her book and Steinbeck's. Quote, in Whose Names Are Unknown, I presented the people in a somewhat different light than in The Grapes of Wrath, and I feel I know these people thoroughly and want readers to know them in this way. At a time when so much of the American West is plagued with natural disasters and climate migrants are a growing worldwide concern, Babb's novel and her extraordinary life offer us a lesson in humility. Had Babb left the FSA camps and finished her novel just a few months earlier, perhaps it would be her Dust Bowl novel, in addition to The Grapes of Wrath, that would be taught in high schools across the country. And perhaps our understanding of that period in history would have been widened to include more than a single story. Thank you, guys. Anyone have any questions? No, you got it all figured out. Andy.
I once knew somebody who was a writer, and he was writing a children's book of Gilgamesh. Version of Gilgamesh, and he sent it into his agent, and the they sent it in to be published, and the publisher, they came back and they said, well, your book is great, but there are 4 other children's books of Gilgamesh coming out all at once.
Yeah.
What are the chances of that? But, and they thought the market was saturated.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
they
that can
couldn't do
happen.
it. So, while I, Ben Surf comes off as an awful person in this thing, I kind of understand where he's coming from.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering, what you do with that. It's just a conundrum,
Yeah, well, I understand what you're saying, but the fact that Steinbeck appropriated her material, so if you look at the book side by side, and I do this
Right.
at the end, he used her content and did not give her any sort of credit for that. And so
Did she challenge him publicly about this?
no, she didn't, because
So
he
you
was,
stole my book.
he won a Pulitzer Prize shortly thereafter, yeah, so they wouldn't have listened to her. So this is like the
Yeah,
late 1930s, early
Right.
1940s in America.
right,
And she had no books under her belt, so she had no, and she was a woman, right? And
yeah,
so
right.
she really didn't have an authority behind her. But I totally see what you're saying, Andy, that there are times when, like, if everybody wrote a book about the same thing, like if you all wrote a book about Sanora Babb and they all came out at the same time, right, it would be
Right,
too much.
right.
Isn't allowed to even open a bank account.
She couldn't open a bank account. Like, there's a lot of things she wasn't allowed to do. Yes, in the back.
That was wonderful. When you approach writing a biography about someone 100 years ago, how do you go about getting details that kind of bring the story to life?
That's a great question. So I absolutely love the archives, which means that I spent 4 years going back and forth to Austin, Texas, to the Harry Ransom Center, where there's 77 boxes of Sanora Babb's materials, including some of the artifacts from her life. Like, there was a Dust Bowl mask that she had there, which was so funny because we were all wearing our COVID masks while we're doing research. Then there's also all of her manuscripts, and like the first version of Whose Names Are Unknown, which did not get published, is so superior to the version that in my opinion, that was finally published. The unedited version is beautiful. So you can read that there. Like, so I spent a lot of time there. I also spent a lot of time interviewing people who knew Babb across the country, and going to the places where she lived. Like, for me to write about a place, especially like eastern Colorado, I'd never been to, and I needed to smell what the soil smelled like. I needed to know what it looked like when you looked at the horizon. It kind of bends because it's so flat. Like, there's all these things that I needed to hear the wild geese overhead. Like, there's just no way that I could write about it without being saturated in it. And I was lucky enough to get to go to these places and see where, the houses where she lived were still standing and things like that. To be a biographer, when you're bringing back voices of people that have been forgotten, you have to find them. They're not easy to find, and there's not a lot of funding there to support you. And so you have to really want to do it. I mean, I self-supported most of this research, and I didn't even get a grant from the Harry Ransom Center where her collection is held, because she isn't, a major writer, so it's not something that would be funded. So it's why we don't see so many stories of women. And then you have to convince the press to actually publish a book about a woman that's been forgotten. But I did, and here it is.
Have there been any repercussions or edits or addenda to Steinbeck's work that says this actually all came from this author, or has there been any
No.
acknowledgement or public notice about it?
So, great question.
I mean, when teachers teach it in high school, they say he stole it from a woman.
So that's my next project. Anyone knows, anyone, state of California, the Department of Education, let me know. Developing curriculum to help change that. The answer to your question is no, that doesn't exist. But there is scholarship in the Steinbeck community where I found evidence. That's where I found this evidence is, I read their articles about comparing the two books. And so they're completely aware of it. But if you do like a Google search and you look for The Grapes of Wrath versus Whose Names Are Unknown, you're gonna find higher rates for the Grapes of Wrath. There isn't, our education system is so much set up on this idea of a single story, this idea of this is the story of the Dust Bowl. And, when I interviewed Dayton Duncan, who is Ken Burns', right-hand man, who helps him with all of his films, and who was the one who brought Sonora's story into their documentary. He told me, he's like, the Grapes of Wrath isn't even a Dust Bowl novel. It doesn't take place where the Dust Bowl happened. It's actually, it takes place in eastern Oklahoma, and you don't see them before it happens. Like, many of you survived, the horrible catastrophes that we've been through as a community here in Sonoma County. And if someone met you on that day when the worst catastrophe of your life happened, you'd be a different person than if they knew you 6 months before, right? So getting to know the Dunn family while they're living on their farm and, not thriving, but they're living life. People are falling in love, people are having, people over for dinner. Like, it's a very normal existence, so that when this happens to them, you have such empathy and understanding. So you get this full idea of, like, these are people that were real people, they're not victims, right? And I think I really wish my grandmother would have gotten to see this book before she passed away, because it made me proud of my heritage in a way that it hadn't been before. And I wish other people who are learning about this era would feel that way as well.
Regarding the Department of Ed, they're really big in social studies, in primary source documents. And a lot of the curricula has been rewritten to cite primary source documents. That might be your way of.
I love it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yes.
I think, like, there's a well-documented, like, meme and jokes in contemporary workplaces where it's like a woman says something in a meeting, nobody takes note of it. The guy says something, everybody's like, great job, congratulations. And I've seen it, I've witnessed it, and I think, like, a lot of times people don't even realize they're taking somebody's ideas. Did Steinbeck, is there any evidence that he understood just how much he listed and, like, the effort that went into the notes? Like, or was he either deliberate, was he clueless, like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Steinbeck called himself a magpie. He appropriated
Explain
content.
that for me.
Yeah, so it's like magpies like steal things. They
Okay.
like see something shiny, they grab it, right? And they use it in their nest. So that's the way he operated as a writer, and he's appropriated content from other people. It's well documented. So
he gave
it was
himself
part of
permission.
it was part of his writing process. And sometimes when I give this talk, people will be like, well, people steal content all the time when they're writers, right? Like, that happens. And it does happen that people borrow content or reuse content or make allusions to other content. But if you're borrowing, the second half of your novel is almost the same as the second half of someone else's novel, and that makes their novel unpublishable, then that is something that's pretty severe. And if you have, you have a higher social status than that person, when I tell the story, the thing is, what's really amazing to me is everyone's like, I believe it, I know. Like, everyone is aware that this happens all the time. And, for my Substack, I write a weekly column about women who have been forgotten or misremembered. And people are like, how are you going to have content for 52 columns a year? And I'm like, are you kidding me? I could write one every day. And if I could make a living off Substack, I would. Because then I could write 365 a year, because every time I write a story, 10 people write me with more stories. And every time I go anywhere, because I'm seeing it now, like, once you see something, you can't not see it. And there's stories everywhere that are coming out to me that I feel obligated now to tell, and I feel obligated to teach others how to tell. So I think it's something that, the patriarchy is strong, but it's also something that we all have voices. We can use our voice, as Patti Smith says, and make a difference, and I was so surprised when my book actually was used to change a place that had shaped me as a writer growing up. A lot of people here who grew up as writers in Sonoma County went to the park as a place to be like, oh my God, you can do that for a living? Like, thank God, because I don't know how to do anything else, right? Like, I just know how to write. And now there's, you know, more of a story that's open to women as well when they're there. So there was, yes.
What occurs to me is, to me, that would have been copyright infringement, because she had her documented notes and he stole them. And so that puzzles me as well, why she didn't even reach out to him on a personal level, let alone a legal level. Do you know what was going on there?
Yeah, her boss gave her notes to John Steinbeck, and those notes were given, you know, in the way that the content was managed at that time. They were the
It was work
property of the FSA and the property of her boss. And so, I mean, you can. Fortunately, they're published now. You can read them on the Dirty Plate Trail. It's a book that someone put out of all her notes, so you don't have to go to the archives to see some of them. So you could read them yourself and see the likeliness. But you're right. Nowadays, if this happened, things would change. But that's because a lot of laws have changed for women as well.
Oh,
So
I know.
we're, you know, as much as we struggle against some laws that get reversed, we still have more rights than we did in 1930, and I'm very grateful for that.
Well, I have another friend who is an artist and an author, and she's created a series of 5 books of forgotten women of color. She started painting, and then she has added short bios of them, because she felt the same way, is why are these women not known? And she, you know, she's so gifted, and she is looking now at how she gives part of the proceeds to a center in Watts for kids so that they can be educated.
That's so great.
But it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna introduce you, Iris,
Please
because
do,
you'll
yeah.
love Carol Jacobson.
Yeah, I love that
She's
she's doing
amazing.
that work. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I mean, I wish more people would do this work. I think it's such an important piece of work.
It is.
Last question.
So, you know, the work that you do as a biographer is one part of your voice, another as a poet. I'm wondering if you could say something about how this project in particular has impacted your voice as a poet, and how, you know, are you still writing poetry, and how those forms intertwine?
Yeah, I am still writing poetry. I can't survive without poetry. And like I said, this is a book of poems that I've written. It's just, I had to deface this book in order to find them. And I've been holding off on publishing it because I want to get photographs of the art and have it side by side with the poetry. Also, I've been slowed down by writing this book. But I still am writing, and whenever I write biography, it's informed by my poetry. So I have to write my way through the archives emotively, like through my through a lyric expression, before I can sit down and write some of these chapters. Like before I could write I wrote the Steinbeck chapter first, just like in my last biography I wrote when Irving Stone messed up the story that was told about Charmian Kittredge London. I wrote that chapter first as well, so just as a way to like get to the emotive part of the story and work my way through it. And for me to do that, I have to, like, I had all these, fears about writing about Steinbeck I had to get through, like all of that has to happen through a poetic project at the same time. So hopefully I'll finish this. Thank you guys so much. It's really wonderful to be here. You can order this book, Whose Names Are Unknown by Sanora Babb. It's available from University of Oklahoma Press, and Jude the Reader's Books will order it for you.
They're sold out right now.
They're sold out right now?
Ooh.
That's awesome. That's the best